There are a few things worth discussing and worth knowing when it comes to trying to mitigate something like tennis elbow. And it's also worth knowing in case you ever find yourself in the future in a place where you actually have tennis elbow and need to get it treated. So the first thing worth knowing in terms of trying to mitigate tennis elbow, because like I said before, we can't fully prevent these things, but we can stack the cards in our favor such that we are less likely to get them, have a better rehab outcome when we do it, and are able to rehab things a little bit quicker along the way. Now, the first thing worth knowing is that even though your symptoms when you have tennis elbow are literally in your elbow, that does not mean that the elbow is the primary or only problem feeding into that tennis elbow. So you want to make sure that you take good care of your neck, your spine, your shoulder, your elbow, your wrist, and so on. You need to assess and address neighboring joints in order to set yourself up for success. Sometimes you'll find that people will get tennis elbow and then they'll treat it and it'll get better and then they'll just get it again. And sometimes that happens because they've actually got a big underlying problem at a neighboring joint which is feeding into that, but they don't know because they haven't had the full chain assessed and they've just zeroed in on the elbow specifically. So again, worth keeping in mind. The other thing worth keeping in mind is that if you just deal with the muscular tissues or the superficial muscular tissues, so for example, the muscles that we're going to work on in the tissue-specific class, they're what we call superficial. So if you think of layers of an onion, they'd be like the outside layers. You can think of the joint as like the deep layers of the onion. If you just address the tissue and you don't address the joint and you have a joint problem, we can also then run into this problem or this scenario where we set ourselves up for experiencing things like tennis elbow or golfer's elbow or just elbow problems, tissue-related problems crossing or of tissues crossing that joint and so on. So you also want to make sure that you have a really good functioning elbow. So the elbow classes, again, like we work on the fundamental movements of the elbow in those classes and we try to set you up for success and try to show you and give you tools to help to build yourself a really good functioning elbow. So again, worth considering that. And then the other problem is that when it comes to tennis elbow, it's commonly thought that the primary or only tissues involved are tissues or muscles that we call ECRB and ECRL. Now you don't need to know the fancy names for those muscles, you can Google them if you'd like to, but that if we just assume that those are the primary tissues without getting an assessment, and this is why if you ever find yourself with tennis elbow, go get assessed. If we just assume that those are the primary tissues, we can miss things because there are other tissues that can and often are involved. And if we just give somebody a tennis elbow protocol, which unfortunately does happen, without assessing to see what tissues are at play here, we can run into problems. So we're also going to be using or training a different tissue in today's class called extensor digitorum, which is often missed when it comes to tennis elbow as well. But there can be other tissues involved in tennis elbow too, and that's why it's important to go get assessed if you ever find yourself with tennis elbow, and to find a trusted practitioner that knows how to assess all of the tissues of the forearm so that they can determine with your case of tennis elbow, if you ever have it, what tissues are primarily involved for you, and therefore that will inform your treatment. The other problem when it comes to tennis elbow is that the formal name for tennis elbow is lateral epicondylitis. Now, once again, you don't need to know the big fancy name, but whenever you hear something that ends with itis, it usually means inflammatory, because we used to think that tennis elbow was an inflammation problem, that it was an inflammatory condition. And now if you look at the more recent literature, it suggests that that's not the case. So there is an initial phase of inflammation, as there is with most injuries. So when you first injure that elbow and we first kind of push that tissue past its threshold, we start to see an inflammatory response. But people often have tennis elbow symptoms for weeks, for months, and unfortunately, sometimes even a year plus. And so the inflammatory problem is usually in the early phase, but there's also this kind of chronic or degenerative change to the tissues. And the degeneration of that tissue also needs to be treated as well. So if we just try to look at tennis elbow as an inflammatory problem, people are often prescribed rest and ice and compression and the things that are unfortunately still being recommended for inflammatory based problems. and some of which aren't always super helpful. But if you just rest the elbow and you don't deal with the actual tissue quality and tissue capacity, then we miss, again, another big picture there. So the last thing that I see people running into, or problem that I see people running into, is that when they are trying to rehab with tennis elbow, sometimes people jump to eccentrics too quickly, especially if they're still in that inflammatory phase and their body is still working to try and clear that inflammation. If you jump to eccentrics right away, which is basically where the muscle is working and contracting, but also lengthening at the same time, which is the hardest type of contraction to recover from, but has a lot of benefits when done at the appropriate time, we can also end up making the problem worse instead of better and pushing that person into or keeping them in that inflammatory phase. So we want to start with things like isometrics. So your first class for this tennis elbow, the tissue specific class with the tissue often involved in tennis elbow, you're going to notice that we focus on isometrics, and that is important. Whenever you watch one of my videos, make sure to check the description below the video, because I'll always drop links to related videos, links to exercises that would go well with the one that you just finished watching, links to free mobility classes, ebooks, and to my ever-growing library of full-length training videos. Additionally, if you found this specific video helpful, please let me know by hitting the like button below, and that'll send me the message that you want to see more videos like this one. You can also subscribe to be notified when new videos like this one are available. And if there's something specific that you want to see a video on, just let me know in the comments below and we'll try and make that happen. Otherwise, take care and we'll see you in the next one.